In a small monastery in southern Italy, something impossible was happening. A young priest's hands had begun to bleed, not from injury, not from accident, but spontaneously, inexplicably, continuously. The wounds pierced straight through his palms, front to back, and they would not heal. For 50 years they would not heal. Medical doctors examined them, skeptics investigated them, and millions of people would eventually come to witness them. This was not a legend. This was not medieval folklore. This happened in the 20th century, in the age of antibiotics and airplanes, of world wars and scientific rationalism. His name was Francesco Forgione, but the world would come to know him as Padre Pio. And the bleeding hands were only the beginning. He was reported to bilocate, appearing in 2 places simultaneously. He was said to read souls, knowing the sins of strangers before they spoke a word. The scent of roses and other unexplained fragrances would emanate from his presence. He allegedly battled demons in his cell at night, the sounds of violence echoing through the monastery walls. He lived on almost no sleep and virtually no food for decades, defying basic human physiology. The Vatican investigated him repeatedly. They silenced him. They restricted his ministry. They doubted him. Yet the people never stopped coming. By the end of his life, tens of thousands would gather just to glimpse him, to receive his blessing, to attend his mass. Kings and peasants, scientists and laborers, believers and skeptics all made the pilgrimage to San Giovanni Rotondo, a remote village that had been forgotten by time, until one suffering monk transformed it into one of the most visited Christian sites on earth. This is not a story about miracles alone, though miracles surround it. This is a story about suffering and faith, about a man who bore wounds he never asked for and carried burdens most of us cannot imagine. This is a story about the collision between the mysterious and the modern, between ancient spirituality and contemporary skepticism. This is the story of Padre Pio, the stigmatic friar who became one of the most documented mystics in history, whose life raises questions that science and faith still struggle to answer. Francesco Forgione was born on May 25, 1887, in Pietrelcina, a small agricultural town in southern Italy, in the province of Benevento. His world was one of profound poverty, back-breaking labor, and deep Catholic faith. His parents, Grazio Forgione and Maria Giuseppa di Nunzio, were peasant farmers who worked land they did not own, scratching out survival from the hard soil of southern Italy. They lived in a society where most people never traveled more than a few miles from where they were born, where illiteracy was common, and where the church was the center of all community life. Francesco was the 4th of 8 children, though only 5 would survive to adulthood. Infant mortality was simply a fact of life in that time and place. The family lived in a small stone house with a dirt floor. There was no electricity, no running water, no modern conveniences whatsoever. Life revolved around the seasons, the harvest, the holy days. His mother was known for her piety, often taking young Francesco to the local church of St. Anne. His father was a man of few words but strong faith, who would eventually emigrate temporarily to America to earn money to support the family and pay for Francesco's education. From his earliest years, Francesco displayed an unusual religiosity. While other children played in the streets, he would withdraw to pray. His mother later recalled that he seemed to live in constant conversation with Jesus and Mary, speaking to them as naturally as he spoke to his family. He claimed to see his guardian angel regularly, and for years he assumed everyone else did too. He experienced visions of Jesus and Mary from the age of 5. To him, the supernatural realm was not distant or theoretical. It was immediate, tangible, ever-present. At age 5, Francesco told his mother that he wanted to become a friar. She thought it was a childish fancy, but the desire never wavered. He consecrated himself to Mary and began practicing severe penances even as a child. He would sleep on a stone floor with a rock as a pillow. He fasted rigorously. He was developing a spirituality of suffering that would define his entire life. A spirituality rooted in the Catholic tradition of redemptive suffering, the belief that one could unite one's pain with the sufferings of Christ for the salvation of souls. The boy's education was limited. He learned to read and write, but his formal schooling was minimal. What he lacked in academic training, however, he made up for in spiritual intensity. By age 15, he had decided definitively to enter religious life. On January 6, 1903, at the age of 15, Francesco entered the novitiate of the Capuchin friars at Morcone. The Capuchins were a reform branch of the Franciscan order, known for their strict poverty, their brown hooded robes, and their emphasis on preaching and service to the poor. He took the name Pio after Pope Pius III, whose relic was enshrined in the chapel at Morcone. From that moment, Francesco Forgione became Fra Pio, and later, when ordained, Padre Pio. The name means pious or dutiful, and it would prove prophetic. The young friar's time in formation was marked by severe illness. He suffered from what doctors could not adequately diagnose. He had fevers that spiked to dangerous levels. He had respiratory problems. He was frail and often seemed on the verge of death. Again and again, his superiors sent him home to Pietrelcina to recover, unsure whether he would survive. Modern researchers have speculated about various conditions, perhaps tuberculosis, perhaps bronchial asthma, perhaps something psychosomatic. Whatever the cause, the pattern was established. Padre Pio would spend much of his life in physical suffering. Yet he persevered. On August 10, 1910, at the age of 23, he was ordained a priest in the Cathedral of Benevento. He celebrated his first Mass in the Church of St. Anne in Pietrelcina, the same church where his mother had brought him as a child. It was a moment of profound joy for his family, who had sacrificed much to see their son reach this day. But Padre Pio's health remained precarious. He spent the next 6 years living mostly at home in Pietrelcina rather than in community with his brother friars, a special dispensation granted because of his health. These years of isolation were years of intense mystical experience. Padre Pio later described visions, ecstasies, and spiritual battles with demons. He claimed that Satan appeared to him in various forms, sometimes as a frightening figure, sometimes as a seductive presence, sometimes as Christ himself, to deceive him. He said he could distinguish the true from the false only by the feelings of peace or agitation that accompanied the visions. His spiritual director, Father Benedetto, corresponded with him regularly during this period, and their letters reveal a young priest undergoing extraordinary spiritual experiences that his director struggled to understand or manage. In these letters, Padre Pio described what he called transverberation, a mystical wound to the heart. On August 5, 1918, while praying in the choir of the church, he experienced what he described as a vision of a heavenly being holding a flaming lance. The being thrust the lance into his soul, causing a wound that, while invisible, caused him continual pain for the rest of his life. This mystical wounding of the heart is a phenomenon reported by other mystics, most famously Saint Teresa of Avila. Then came September 20th, 1918. It was a Friday, and Padre Pio was making thanksgiving after Mass in the church of the monastery at San Giovanni Rotondo, where he had been assigned 2 years earlier. He was alone, kneeling before a large crucifix. What happened next would change his life forever and ignite a controversy that would last decades. According to his own account, he saw a vision of Christ on the cross. From the wounds of Christ, rays of light shot forth and struck him in the hands, feet, and side. When the vision ended, he found himself bleeding from all 5 locations corresponding to the crucifixion wounds of Jesus. The stigmata had appeared. The wounds went completely through his hands, front to back. His feet bore similar wounds, and his side bled as if pierced by a lance. The wounds were painful. They bled regularly, and despite countless medical examinations over the following 50 years, they never became infected, and they never healed. Padre Pio was horrified. He had not sought this. He had prayed for suffering, yes, but privately, invisibly. Now he bore visible marks that would make him a spectacle. He begged God to remove the visible signs while allowing him to keep the pain. His prayer was not answered. The wounds remained, bleeding daily, requiring him to wear fingerless gloves to hide them and to change bandages regularly to manage the blood. News of the stigmata spread rapidly despite the friar's attempts at discretion. Within weeks, people began arriving at San Giovanni Rotondo, a remote and impoverished village in the Gargano Mountains of southern Italy. They came to see the stigmatic priest, to seek his blessing, to ask for prayers. The trickle became a stream, and the stream became a flood. The quiet monastery was suddenly overwhelmed. The Catholic Church's response was cautious and, in many ways, hostile. Stigmata was not unknown in church history. Saint Francis of Assisi was the first recorded stigmatic in 1224. Since then, hundreds of cases had been claimed, though the church authenticated very few. The phenomenon was viewed with deep suspicion. It could be holy, or it could be hysteria. It could be divine, or it could be demonic. It could be genuine, or it could be fraud. The Vatican sent investigators. Medical doctors examined Padre Pio. Professor Romanelli from the Barletta City Hospital examined him in 1919 and found the wounds inexplicable by natural causes. Dr. Festa, a physician who examined him multiple times, concluded that the wounds showed characteristics unlike any natural wounds he had seen. They did not suppurate, did not show signs of infection despite being open wounds, and remained remarkably consistent in appearance over time. Yet other doctors were more skeptical. Dr. Amico Bignami, a professor of pathology, examined him in 1920 and suggested the wounds could be maintained by artificial means, though he offered no proof. The ecclesiastical investigations were even more problematic. Father Agostino Gemelli, a physician and Franciscan priest who later became a prominent psychologist, examined Padre Pio in 1920 and concluded without physical examination, he merely observed from a distance that the stigmata was the product of religious hysteria and neurosis. His report to the Vatican was damning, suggesting Padre Pio was psychologically disturbed and possibly maintaining the wounds artificially with carbolic acid or another caustic substance. Based partly on Gemelli's report, the Vatican imposed severe restrictions on Padre Pio in 1923. He was forbidden to say Mass in public. He was forbidden to show the stigmata to anyone. He was forbidden to correspond with his spiritual directees. He was effectively silenced and isolated within his own monastery. For Padre Pio, who saw his priesthood as his entire purpose, this was devastating. He obeyed without protest, but the suffering was immense. The restrictions were partially lifted in 1933, allowing him to resume saying Mass in public, but the Vatican's suspicion remained. Throughout the 1920s and 1930s, the church hierarchy seemed determined to suppress what they saw as dangerous enthusiasm and possible deception. Meanwhile, the people continued to come. They did not need Vatican approval to believe in the holiness of the suffering friar. They saw his obvious pain, his humility, his patience under persecution, and they believed. What was life like for Padre Pio during these decades? It was a life of routine suffering and extraordinary mystical phenomena. He slept perhaps 2 or 3 hours per night, often less. He ate very little, sometimes going days with nothing but a piece of fruit or a small amount of pasta. Medical examination would later estimate his daily caloric intake at around 300 to 400 calories, yet he maintained his weight and functioned actively. This was physically impossible by normal standards, yet it continued for decades. His Mass was an event unto itself. He would begin before dawn, and the Mass would often last 2 or 3 hours, sometimes longer. He would appear to enter deep states of contemplation, seemingly oblivious to his surroundings, lost in the mystery he was celebrating. People reported that watching him say Mass was like watching someone in direct conversation with the divine. He wept frequently during Mass. His face would contort in what appeared to be both agony and ecstasy. The wounds in his hands bled onto the altar linens. After Mass, he would hear confessions. This is where Padre Pio's reputation grew most powerfully. He spent up to 10 hours per day in the confessional, hearing the confessions of hundreds of people. And it was in the confessional that the most remarkable reports emerged. People claimed he knew their sins before they spoke. He would tell penitents about sins they had forgotten or deliberately concealed. He would refuse absolution to those who were not truly contrite, sometimes abruptly dismissing them from the confessional, telling them to come back when they were ready. He could be stern, even harsh, but always for the purpose of genuine conversion. There are countless documented accounts of his apparent ability to read souls. A man would come to confession intending to deceive, and Padre Pio would confront him with the specific sins he was hiding. A woman would confess one sin, and he would tell her about 3 others she had omitted. Skeptics suggest this was shrewd psychology, an ability to read people, but the accounts are too numerous and too specific to dismiss so easily. People reported that he knew details of their lives he could not possibly have known by natural means. He also demonstrated what appeared to be the gift of prophecy. He would tell people about future events in their lives. He warned people to avoid certain trips, and those who ignored the warnings sometimes met with accidents. He told parents about vocations their children would have years later. He predicted healings and conversions. Again, the accounts are extensive and well documented. Perhaps most striking were the reports of bilocation, the mystical phenomenon of appearing in 2 places at the same time. Numerous witnesses claimed to have encountered Padre Pio in locations distant from San Giovanni Rotondo, while other witnesses confirmed he had never left the monastery. A man in Uruguay claimed Padre Pio appeared to him and instructed him to travel to Italy. When he arrived at San Giovanni Rotondo months later, Padre Pio greeted him by name and referenced their previous conversation, even though they had never met by ordinary means. A woman in Pennsylvania claimed Padre Pio appeared at her bedside when she was dying and prayed with her. Military pilots during World War II reported seeing a friar in the sky gesturing for them to turn back, preventing them from bombing San Giovanni Rotondo. When they later saw photographs of Padre Pio, they identified him as the figure they had seen. The documentation of these accounts varies. Some are well attested with multiple witnesses and contemporary records. Others are more anecdotal. But the sheer volume of such reports, coming from people of different nationalities and backgrounds who had no connection to each other, creates a cumulative weight that is difficult to dismiss entirely. Then there were the physical phenomena that accompanied his presence. Many people reported smelling roses, violets, or other floral fragrances in his presence or in connection with him, even when no flowers were present. This phenomenon, known as the odor of sanctity, has been reported with other mystics and saints throughout church history. People would smell the fragrance miles away from the monastery and know that Padre Pio was praying for them. Others would smell it at the moment of healing or conversion. Skeptics attribute this to suggestion or coincidence, but again, the reports are numerous and persistent. His nights were reportedly filled with spiritual combat. The friars who lived in the monastery with him testified to hearing crashes, shouts, and sounds of violence coming from his cell. In the morning, they would find his cell in disarray, furniture overturned, and Padre Pio bruised and exhausted. He claimed he was attacked regularly by demons who resented his ministry and sought to prevent him from saving souls. To modern ears, this sounds like the stuff of medieval superstition. But the physical evidence of the disturbances was witnessed by multiple people over many years. Throughout all of this, Padre Pio maintained a posture of humility and obedience. He never sought attention. He never promoted himself. He tried to hide the stigmata. He deflected praise. He was often gruff and impatient, particularly with the curious who came for sensation rather than genuine faith. But to those who came with sincere hearts, he was infinitely patient and compassionate. He suffered their questions, their requests, their needs, hour after hour, day after day, year after year. The 1940s brought World War II to Italy, and San Giovanni Rotondo was not spared. The region saw fighting, occupation, and hardship. Padre Pio ministered throughout, offering what comfort he could. The stories of his protection of the monastery during bombing raids became part of his legend. After the war, his fame grew exponentially. The post-war period saw increased mobility and communication. Word of the stigmatic friar spread across Europe and beyond. The Vatican's attitude remained ambivalent. In 1960, Cardinal Ottaviani of the Holy Office sent another round of restrictions, again limiting Padre Pio's public ministry. He was allowed to say Mass and hear confessions, but further restrictions were placed on his interactions with the public. Some historians believe this was due to concerns about the growing cult surrounding him, concerns about financial irregularities in the management of the hospital he had founded, and concerns about maintaining control over popular devotion. Yet Pope Pius XII privately expressed devotion to Padre Pio. Pope John XXIII was more skeptical, but never definitively condemned him. Pope Paul VI, when still Cardinal Montini, came to believe in Padre Pio's holiness. The gap between official Vatican policy and private papal opinion was significant. Throughout these difficulties, Padre Pio's greatest achievement was taking shape. He had long dreamed of building a hospital to serve the poor of the region. With the help of wealthy benefactors and tireless fundraising, that dream became reality. In 1956, the Casa Sollievo della Sofferenza, the home for the relief of suffering, opened its doors. It was a modern, well-equipped hospital built in one of the poorest regions of Italy, offering advanced medical care to people who had never had access to such resources. It was Padre Pio's way of combining spiritual ministry with practical charity, of showing that faith must express itself in concrete service to human need. The hospital became one of the most advanced medical centers in Italy. It attracted top physicians and researchers. It provided free or low-cost care to thousands. It stood as a monument to what Padre Pio believed about the integration of healing the body and healing the soul. Today, it remains a major medical institution, treating hundreds of thousands of patients and employing thousands of people. As the 1960s progressed, Padre Pio's health, always precarious, began to decline more seriously. The years of minimal sleep and food, the decades of bearing the stigmata, the endless hours in the confessional, all took their toll. He developed arthritis and respiratory problems. He needed increasing assistance to walk and to celebrate Mass. But he continued his ministry with whatever strength remained. The crowds never diminished. If anything, they grew, as if people sensed that time was running short. In his final years, after the Second Vatican Council, the restrictions on his ministry were finally lifted. The Church seemed to recognize that the investigation and suspicion had gone on long enough. Padre Pio was allowed to minister freely, though his physical capacity was fading. Those who saw him in these years described a man worn down by suffering, but still radiating a profound spiritual presence. On September 22, 1968, Padre Pio celebrated the 50th anniversary of his Stigmata. He said Mass before a huge crowd. His brother friars had to support him through the celebration. He was 81 years old and visibly failing. The next day, September 23rd, his condition worsened. He spent the day in his cell, praying and resting. That evening, he asked to make his confession and to renew his Franciscan vows. In the early hours of September 23, 1968, at 2:30 in the morning, Padre Pio died quietly in his cell. He was repeating the names Jesus, Mary. When they prepared his body for viewing, the friars made a startling discovery. The stigmata were gone. The wounds that had marked his hands, feet, and side for 50 years had completely disappeared. His hands were smooth and unmarked, as if the wounds had never existed. Only a faint reddening remained where the stigmata had been. This final mystery deepened the enigma of his life. Why had the wounds appeared? Why had they persisted for 50 years? And why did they vanish at his death? Over 100,000 people filed past his body in the 3 days before his burial. The funeral was an enormous event, with massive crowds filling every space in and around the monastery. He was buried in the crypt of the monastery church in San Giovanni Rotondo, and immediately his tomb became a pilgrimage site. The Vatican, which had investigated and restricted him in life, now moved toward recognizing his sanctity. The investigation process for canonization began relatively quickly. Witnesses were interviewed. Documents were examined. Alleged miracles attributed to his intercession were investigated. The process that had doubted him in life now worked to vindicate him. In 1999, Pope John Paul II beatified Padre Pio, declaring him blessed. On June 16, 2002, the same pope canonized him, declaring him Saint Pio of Pietrelcina. The ceremony in Rome drew hundreds of thousands of pilgrims. The friar who had been silenced and restricted was now officially recognized as a saint by the very institution that had once viewed him with such suspicion. In 2008, his body was exhumed for examination and veneration. It was found to be in remarkable condition, though not incorrupt in the traditional sense. The body was preserved and placed on display in the new church built to accommodate the millions of pilgrims who visit San Giovanni Rotondo each year. Today, the sanctuary of St. Pio is one of the most visited Christian pilgrimage sites in the world, second in Italy only to the Vatican itself. So what are we to make of Padre Pio? How do we understand a life so filled with phenomena that challenge our normal categories of experience? For believers, he is a clear sign of God's action in the world, a demonstration that the age of miracles has not passed, that sanctity is still possible, that the supernatural still breaks into the natural. He is proof that faith is not mere psychology or wishful thinking, but a response to real divine presence. For skeptics, the story is more complicated. They point to the lack of controlled scientific study during his lifetime. They note that nearly all the evidence is testimonial rather than empirical. They suggest that the stigmata could have been maintained by artificial means, though they struggle to explain how this could continue undetected for 50 years with multiple medical examinations. They attribute the reports of bilocation and prophecy to exaggeration, false memory, and the tendency of believers to see miracles where none exist. They see Padre Pio as a product of his culture, a pious man whose genuine devotion became embellished into legend. Yet even skeptical investigators have found aspects of his life difficult to explain. The medical evidence regarding the stigmata, while not conclusive, is troubling for those who want to dismiss it entirely. The wounds were examined by numerous doctors over 50 years. None could adequately explain them by natural pathology. The testimony regarding his minimal food and sleep, if accurate, defies physiological possibility. The sheer number of people who testified to experiences they attributed to his intercession creates a challenge for those who would dismiss all of it as delusion or fraud. Perhaps the most compelling evidence is not any single miracle but the cumulative effect of his life. Here was a man who lived in obscurity, who sought no fame, who tried to hide his extraordinary gifts, who suffered greatly throughout his life, and who devoted himself entirely to the service of others. He heard confessions for 10 hours a day despite bearing painful wounds. He built a hospital for the poor. He lived in the strictest poverty, owning nothing. He obeyed even when church authorities restricted his ministry unjustly. He bore persecution without complaint. This is not the profile of a fraud or a hysteric. Frauds seek benefit from their deceptions. Hysterics are unstable and inconsistent. Padre Pio was neither. He was remarkably consistent over decades, remarkably humble despite international fame, remarkably focused on serving others rather than promoting himself. Even if one doubts every miraculous claim, the basic outline of his life describes a man of extraordinary virtue and dedication. The theological significance of stigmata in Catholic understanding relates to the concept of redemptive suffering. The idea is that Christians can unite their sufferings with the sufferings of Christ, that pain accepted and offered in faith has spiritual value, that one can, in a mysterious way, participate in the redemptive work of Christ by bearing suffering for the sake of others. This is rooted in passages like Colossians 1:24, where Paul speaks of filling up what is lacking in Christ's afflictions for the sake of the church. In this understanding, Padre Pio's stigmata was not a reward but a share in the cross. He bore the marks of Christ's passion so that others might encounter the reality of Christ's sacrifice. The wounds were a sign, a sacramental presence that made visible the invisible reality of redemption. People who saw the bleeding hands were meant to remember that salvation came at the cost of suffering, that love required sacrifice, that faith was not cheap grace but a serious commitment. This is profoundly countercultural in a modern context. We live in an age that seeks to eliminate suffering, to anesthetize pain, to find the comfortable path. The idea that suffering might have value, that it might be embraced rather than merely endured, that it might even be redemptive, is alien to contemporary sensibility. Yet this was the core of Padre Pio's spirituality. He did not seek suffering for its own sake, but he accepted it as a participation in divine love. The mystical phenomena reported in his life, the bilocation, the reading of souls, the prophecy, the spiritual combat, all serve in Catholic theology to authenticate the holiness of the mystic and to serve the spiritual good of others. They are not magic tricks or supernatural entertainment. They are charisms, gifts given for the building up of the church and the salvation of souls. If authentic, they point beyond themselves to the God who gives them. The scientific mind struggles with such claims because they cannot be repeated under controlled conditions. Mystical experience by its nature is not subject to laboratory verification. It happens when and how it happens, not when researchers are watching with instruments ready. This creates an epistemological gap. Those who witnessed these phenomena firsthand found them compelling. Those who read about them secondhand can always find room for doubt. Yet we should be careful about chronological snobbery, the assumption that modernity has debunked the supernatural. Science has not proven that bilocation is impossible, only that it does not fit current physical models. Science has not proven that stigmata cannot occur, only that it does not understand the mechanism if it does. The absence of a scientific explanation is not the same as proof of impossibility. What is perhaps most significant about Padre Pio's life is what it reveals about the hunger in human hearts for connection with the transcendent. Millions of people made the pilgrimage to see him. They waited for hours just to attend his Mass or to go to confession to him. They sought his blessing, his prayers, his intercession. Why? Because they intuited in him a connection to something beyond the material, something that gave meaning and hope to their lives. In an increasingly secularized Europe, in a world recovering from the devastation of 2 world wars, in a time of rapid modernization and social change, people flocked to a monastery to encounter a suffering friar. This tells us something about the limits of materialism and rationalism to satisfy the human spirit. It suggests that the elimination of mystery from the world creates a void that people will seek to fill. Padre Pio offered no political solutions, no economic programs, no technological advances. He offered suffering, prayer, and sacrament. And people found in those things what they could not find elsewhere: meaning, purpose, hope, healing. Whether one believes in the miraculous claims or not, the social and psychological reality of his impact is undeniable. He changed lives. He inspired conversions. He gave people reasons to hope and to persevere. His legacy continues today through the millions who visit his shrine, through the hospital that serves the poor, through the prayer groups that meet in his name around the world, through the countless people who claim to have experienced his intercession even decades after his death. The website tracking visits to religious sites consistently ranks San Giovanni Rotondo among the top pilgrimage destinations globally. The controversy surrounding him has never entirely disappeared. There are still those who doubt the authenticity of the Stigmata, who question the miracle claims, who see the devotion to him as misplaced or excessive. The Church itself, in canonizing him, did not make definitive pronouncements about every reported miracle. The canonization declared that he lived a life of heroic virtue and that miracles occurred through his intercession sufficient to warrant sainthood. It did not require belief in every phenomenon associated with him. This allows space for a range of responses. One can venerate Saint Pio while remaining agnostic about specific miracle claims. One can appreciate his virtue and service while doubting the Stigmata. Or one can embrace the full narrative as presented by his devotees. The Church's canonization establishes that he is in heaven and worthy of veneration, not that every story told about him is necessarily accurate in every detail. What cannot be doubted is that Padre Pio's life poses profound questions about the nature of reality, the relationship between body and spirit, the possibility of divine action in the world, and the meaning of suffering. These are not questions science alone can answer. They require philosophical and theological reflection. They require openness to dimensions of experience that cannot be reduced to material causation. In the end, Padre Pio stands as a sign of contradiction, as saints often do. He contradicts the assumption that the modern world has outgrown the supernatural. He contradicts the notion that suffering is meaningless. He contradicts the belief that human fulfillment comes through comfort and pleasure. He contradicts the idea that the spiritual life is merely subjective experience with no objective reality. Whether one accepts him as a genuine mystic or views him as a product of psychological and cultural forces, his life cannot be easily dismissed. The evidence is too substantial, the witnesses too numerous, the effects too lasting. He lived openly, he was extensively documented, he was repeatedly investigated, and he left behind a legacy that continues to shape millions of lives. The bleeding hands that began this story remained a mystery to the end. Medical science could not adequately explain them. The Church investigated them repeatedly. Skeptics proposed theories that never quite fit the evidence, and then, at death, they vanished as mysteriously as they had appeared, leaving behind only smooth skin and deeper questions. Perhaps that is the point. Perhaps the Stigmata were meant not to provide answers, but to provoke questions, to challenge assumptions, to remind us that reality may be larger and stranger than our categories allow. Perhaps Padre Pio's life is meant to make us wonder whether the universe is more than matter and energy, whether human beings are more than biological machines, whether love and sacrifice and faith might be realities as fundamental as anything physics describes. 50 years of bleeding wounds that did not infect, decades of ministry on minimal food and sleep, thousands of confessions heard with apparent knowledge of hidden sins, reports of appearing in distant places while never leaving the monastery, healings attributed to his prayers, conversions sparked by his words, a life of suffering embraced for the sake of others, a hospital built from nothing to serve the poor, and in the end, a quiet death in a monastery cell, the wounds vanishing, the suffering complete, the mission accomplished. This was Padre Pio. This was the life of the stigmatic friar of San Giovanni Rotondo. Whatever conclusions one draws about the miraculous claims, the basic facts describe a life of remarkable dedication, profound faith, and extraordinary impact. In an age of skepticism and materialism, he stood as a witness to another possibility, another way of understanding human existence and divine presence. The monastery where he lived still stands. The church where he celebrated Mass welcomes pilgrims daily. The confessional where he read souls has been preserved. The hospital he built continues to heal. And the questions he raises remain, waiting for each new generation to grapple with them, to decide what they believe about suffering and sanctity, about miracle and mystery, about the visible and the invisible, about Padre Pio of Pietrelcina, the priest with the bleeding hands.